Good morning, and thank you so much for having me by remote access. I'm very sorry I couldn't join you in person for what looks like an incredible conference. My name is Zachary Goldman. I practice law in the Financial and Business Integrity Group at the law firm Wilmer Hale, and I'm an adjunct professor of law at NYU School of Law. I'm going to speak about sanctions from the American perspective for a few minutes, and broadly want to make 3 points. The first is about the purpose of financial sanctions. The second is a point about unilateralism, and the third is about extraterritorial sanctions, both real and perceived. In terms of the purpose of financial sanctions, the critical objective for the use of this tool is the protection of the national security interest of the state. This has a couple of implications for the way in which sanctions are utilized that demand that they both be integrated into a broader diplomatic and strategic context, and often, but not always, that they are implemented in concert with like-minded allies. The second point will become apparent in a minute when we speak about unilateral imposition of sanctions, but it's almost always the case that when attempting to change behavior, which is fundamentally what sanctions are useful for, it is important to do so in concert with others. This both helps avoid problems regarding sanctions evasion and also sends a clear message to the target of the sanctions that the behavior they're engaged in is undesirable and must stop. Another broadly discussed use for sanctions is prevention of illicit activity, simply making it costlier, riskier, and less efficient for bad actors to use the financial system for illicit purposes. I now want to make a broad point about unilateralism. It is often said that multilateral sanctions are best, whether imposed through the United Nations or by a community of like-minded allies. And that is almost always true. It would be impossible to conceive of the objective that was accomplished with the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, without a large group of actors, both multinational actors like the EU and states like Germany, China, Russia, the United States, and Iran, acting in concert toward a common goal. It is, however, important to remember that because sanctions are inherent in the national security function of states and are designed to protect the national security interests of states, they retain the ability and indeed the right to impose sanctions unilaterally when needed. And because states perceive their interests differently, states will determine that it's important to use sanctions in different circumstances. A clear example of this in the US is the Narco-Trafficking Sanctions Program, which was adopted in the mid-1990s in the face of significant expansion in drug trafficking activity. It's not replicated elsewhere, but by all measures has been one of the most successful sanctions programs in the US diplomatic and financial toolkit. Similarly, the EU recently imposed sanctions on Turkey without a clear US analog, and the EU also has sanctions programs that cover Tunisia, Egypt, and other Arab Spring states, and that attempt to dissuade and recover assets that have been misappropriated by the former regimes of these states that are not, again, duplicated by other countries. And it's important to preserve the ability of EU member states to impose sanctions unilaterally when they perceive it to be in their interests, even if they don't have, for example, a majority of the Security Council that's willing to follow. The third point I want to make is about extraterritorial sanctions. And there's two senses in which people talk about extraterritorial sanctions. The first, I think, is probably not accurately described as extraterritorial sanctions, but the second is, and is much more rarely used. We often think about extraterritoriality as derived from the power of the dollar. In this sense, dollar-denominated transactions of any size conducted anywhere in the world by sophisticated commercial actors often have to adhere to the terms of US sanctions. This isn't because of a technical extraterritorial effect, rather a practical one, because the reason those transactions have to comply with US sanctions rules is because they almost always clear through banks headquartered in the US, and those banks headquartered in the US obviously have to follow US law. I therefore think it's not, strictly speaking, accurate to talk about those types of sanctions as extraterritorial. In practice, they may feel as though they are, but when kind of examined from a technical legal perspective, the sanctions regulations are imposed on the US dollar clearing banks in New York, not on the foreign parties themselves. There is, of course, a sense in which extraterritorial sanctions are used by the US and others, although very, very rarely. The most powerful example of this in the US arsenal is the Iran Sanctions Act, as it had been amended several times since initial adoption in 1996. The 2010 amendments to that statute, the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2010, is widely credited with generating the leverage necessary to bring Iran to the table and to begin the serious negotiations that resulted in the JCPOA in 2015. Notwithstanding the power of those sanctions, they actually have been implemented only seldom. Nonetheless, they do remain a point of contention internationally. I think that the discussion about extraterritoriality and the power of the US dollar in leveraging the US-based financial system to achieve change in behavior through sanctions is an incredibly important issue. Because the power of the dollar is persistent and is not likely to be supplanted as the world's reserve currency anytime soon, although it may be in certain discrete instances supplanted by the yuan or other currencies. This is an important dialogue, and that I look forward to continuing to be a part of it. Thank you very much again for having me.